All right. So, just to make sure that we are all kind of coming from the same place, if we think about what risk and protective factors are, risk factors are the conditions or factors or characteristics or settings that increase the likelihood that someone will misuse alcohol. And it's important here when I'm talking about risk and protective factors, I'm not going all the way necessarily to alcohol use disorder. We are really just looking at the kind of the broader population level impact of alcohol misuse. Could include binge drinking, excessive alcohol consumption or heavy alcohol consumption, underage drinking, those types of things. And so a lot of this are also risk factors, of course, for alcohol use disorder, but we're really also just thinking about those earlier risk factors that lead to the greatest number of consequences within a community. And then protective factors are, of course, on the flip side of that. So what is helping reduce the likelihood of alcohol misuse, even when those risk factors are present? So they end up being really strong determinants of prevention or protection because they also work when those risk factors are present. And so we'll talk about what some of those actually are. You probably all know this, but just to reiterate why we want to look at these risk and protective factors in communities, and it's for four main reasons that I think of. One is it helps us know where to focus. The thing about this work, as I'm sure you all know, is that there's a million things we could be doing at any given time, and none of us have the bandwidth or capacity to address all of them. And so looking at these risk and protective factors say, okay, we know that these are issues in our community that are putting our youth or people at higher risk of excessive alcohol use. Let's focus on one or two of those, or let's strengthen these protective factors that exist and we just want to continue to build on them. It also allows us to look at time over time at what's changing. So if we have really concrete mechanisms of risk or protection and we're trying to intervene on them, we can look down the road and say, okay, we've made a difference in this, and as a result, we're seeing X, Y, and Z. Like you all, it's helping build coalition. It brings folks together. If you're saying we're working on this particular risk factor or strengthening this particular protective factor, you bring in new stakeholders and partners to the table and you can work together to address those issues. And then really critical to a lot of the work of a policy alliance or policy effort is there are a lot of evidence-based interventions which directly address risk and protective factors. We'll talk briefly about those at the end. And so it helps support that from an evidence-based perspective. So I'm going to talk about risk factors for youth and risk factors for adults, but thinking if you just sort of zoom out at what we see over and over again, it's these six key buckets. One is early initiation, and again, many of you know this, but early initiation of any substance, particularly alcohol, drastically increases the likelihood of developing an alcohol use disorder or engaging in risky drinking. So, for example, if you start drinking by the age of 12, the likelihood of you developing an alcohol use disorder goes up exponentially than if you start drinking closer to 18 or 19. So, this early initiation, being able to capture or address kids before they hit that, is really, really important. And it's a reason that a lot of folks are focusing purely on delaying age of initiation. Genetics, of course, are really key. It's much harder to intervene on, but genetics, of course, play a risk. If you come from a family or you have a genealogy of addiction, you are much more likely to develop a different level of alcohol misuse or alcohol use disorder. Mental health co-occurrence, we see this pretty frequently, and there's a bit of a bidirectional component here. So people who are experiencing mental health crises or have a mental health diagnoses are more likely to drink, and if you drink, you are more likely sometimes to develop different components of a mental health diagnosis, whether it's depression, anxiety, or another. There are many of you in the room who deal exactly with this, so you're welcome to expand on that. Trauma, again, we know that if you have a number of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, your likelihood of excessive alcohol use increases. Peer influence, this is one that really does go both ways as a risk and protective factor. So if the majority of people around you drink, you are more likely to drink. But on the flip side, if the majority of people around you don't, you are less likely to drink. So, we can think a lot about that and from a norming perspective as well. And then what we like to focus on from an environmental perspective is how available alcohol is. Where do you see it? Where can you get it? Where is it being offered or provided? And the affordability of alcohol. Your taxes, are they low alcohol taxes? Are you seeing a lot of happy hours, a lot of buy one, get one? How is alcohol being sold and how cheap is it to buy? And we know that the cheaper it is, the more likely people are to drink, and actually increasing the price of alcohol is one of the strongest mechanisms we have to reduce consumption. So often we just see the flip side when we talk about protective factors. So early initiation is a risk, delayed initiation is a protective factor. But it's important to know that this actually is protective. So it's not just if you delay initiation, you're not increasing risk, you're actually building skills to help prevent further misuse. Coping skills, a sense of purpose within your community, whether it be work or school or sports or whatever it may be. Your family connections really, really critical here. So the more supportive a family is and the more engaged a family is, the less likely a youth in particular is to engage in alcohol misuse. You see a lot of that with, the importance of eating meals together and things of that nature. Pro-social peers, we talked about that before. So having peers around you who are engaging in more protective or healthy behaviors and not drinking. Community engagement. So whether you are part of some sort of group in your community is actually a really strong protective factor. And so having opportunities to engage as a community. And then the environmental strategies or policies, like I just mentioned, taxes, we'll talk about density and a few others. So these are all protective factors that actually help reduce the likelihood of excessive alcohol misuse or future alcohol use disorder. So I'm not going to go into all of these because it's a lot and I'm happy to share these slides, but you can see what some of the risk factors for young adults are. And I don't think any of these are going to be particularly shocking to any of you here, but what I want to flag is that a number of these can be really directly addressed through policy, while the other ones are going to be really directly addressed through individual level programs or direct service. So all of these are things that can be dealt with, but things like low cost, high availability, high risk college environments, these are things that we can start to address through policies that help actually reduce these risk factors directly. And then there's a lot of other supports that can come in and help address some of these additional risk factors. And I just want to point out here that you can see that all of these do really have data showing how alcohol is directly tied to these risk factors. But I'm guessing many of you who are in the space of working with different populations, these are also risk factors for mental health issues and other substance use. So a lot of them are not unique. And so addressing one risk factor might help address a number of risk behaviors and is not just focused on alcohol. On the flip side, the protective factors here are many of what we just talked about from the broader thing, but also looking at screening and early intervention, of course. So things like SBIRT or SBIRS or any of the different combinations of screening and brief intervention, referral to treatments. Building clear future goals, so education planning, community involvement, and I really like the idea of youth getting involved in alcohol prevention itself. There's a number of alliances out there that have youth focus on them, etc. So again, these are things that if we're able to strengthen these protective factors, even if these other risk factors exist that we just talked about, they're going to really help protect and reduce the likelihood of alcohol misuse among youth in particular. And then if we look at adults, you see some variation, but again, I don't think any of these are particularly surprising to any of you. But I think it's important for us to look at them because you might not think that alcohol is going to be a risk factor for this. You might be thinking about all of the issues around divorce and relationship loss and the problems that cause, but it does also increase drinking risk, right? And same with chronic pain. We know with chronic pain, we frequently think about substance use and substance misuse, especially if they are being prescribed any pain relievers or opioids. But even without that, you're going to have an alcohol risk. And so it's just as we're thinking about all of these factors that many of you are dealing with and addressing with populations on a daily basis, we need to be thinking about the alcohol component as well as another risk factor that's being added in on top of all these other behaviors that they may be at risk for. Again, these are mostly flip side, but even things like just having good physical health reduces the likelihood of alcohol misuse. Having access to treatments reduces the likelihood of alcohol misuse, even outside of all the other factors that we're talking about. So there's a number of things here that we can continue to build on and support to help address risk and protection within these communities. There are a number of different risk factors that are present for folks who identify with different populations. And there's a lot of words on the slide, I apologize, but I think that it's just as we're out there working with the community and thinking about this, we think about people with different gender or sexual orientation. They have a much higher risk, a much higher risk of alcohol misuse from the discrimination and the stigma that they face on a regular basis. And we see this really commonly in the data that their binge use in particular is pretty double, triple sometimes other populations. Alaska Native and other racial and ethnic minorities, again, you all are seeing this in addressing this on a daily basis, but there is such a legacy of historical trauma and discrimination and the inequitable access to services that does show a really high risk of alcohol misuse. Veterans, people with chronic pain, we talked about a little bit, and then people with a history of traumatic brain injury also all put people at higher risk of some level of alcohol misuse. There's also Alaska-specific context that can amplify risk. Of course, you have this issue of access, just because there are travel barriers sometimes, especially in the winter. There are limited recovery sports in such a large geographic area. To be able to provide the level of support for treatment or recovery is really limited. Housing instability and homelessness. This, of course, is a problem across the country. I live in California. Our homelessness problem here is really challenging, and the high trauma exposure is really, really related to alcohol misuse. Your seasonal and rotational workforces, I was talking with Tesha about this the other week. It's actually really similar to a military context in a lot of ways, where folks are deployed or off working really hard for a set period of time. They come back and they are off to the races in sort of a work hard, play hard mentality as it relates to binge drinking. And so we see that a lot in a seasonal workforce. And then you all have a lot of local policy variation, more than most other states, I will say, where you have wet communities, damp communities, and dry communities, and they change over time. So there's a lot of just really interesting conversations and challenges around binge drinking, bootlegging, the black markets, and all these different ways in which alcohol is provided and consumed within your community. But there's a lot of strengths, I think, that are specific to Alaska. Again, I won't go through all of these, but you can see here that I really think that the networks within Alaska are really tight. The leadership is very strong. The cultural connection is a huge protective factor that is prominent in Alaskan communities. You have a growing recovery infrastructure that we're seeing, and I think that even the presence of an alliance like this is an example of that. And you have a body who's really focused on changing the environment and the structure in which alcohol is produced and consumed. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about here, because underlying all of those risk and protective factors that we talked about is the community and is the conditions in which alcohol is consumed. And so if we're able to reduce the availability of alcohol and reduce the affordability of alcohol, and make sure I got that direction right, we'll be able to help address a lot of those risk and protective factors that are underlying the individual level components. And so I put four key things here that are really important as we're thinking about some of the some of the strategies that help address this. The first is increasing alcohol taxes. And again, I keep harping on this because it's really the biggest thing that we have. So a 10% increase, which is really not that much. Think about it as 10 cents on the dollar, or if you have a $10 beverage, it's a $1 increase. It's a 7% reduction in consumption, which is a really high value, right, cost benefit proposition here. Reducing alcohol outlet density. So the less alcohol is available to be purchased, the less that people are going to consume. Restricting marketing. So exposure to ads is incredibly, incredibly predictive of alcohol misuse, especially among youth. There's a really clear trajectory there. And increasingly, we're starting to have more and more research that shows that exposure to marketing with women on it actually increases rates of domestic violence and sexual assaults. And so there's a number of ways that in reducing marketing, alcohol marketing actually improves a lot of different community variables, alcohol misuse, violence, and others. And then enforcing the minimum age laws that exist. There's a push a lot of times you see to moving towards minimum legal age of 18. There's not, we don't want to move towards an enforcement mode. That's not what I'm talking about necessarily here of individually targeting kids who are drinking, but just ensuring that we're providing that 21 law, supporting it, and then thinking about how we can support structures that help reduce underage drinking, things like ID laws, compliance checks, etc. So it's not about focusing on individuals who are drinking, but focusing on the system in which individuals are drinking and getting their alcohol and drinking it. So I really want to drive home that risk and protective factors happen at the individual level, the family level, the community level, and these policies and environmental approaches help address all of that and really kind of bring the ground up on both those risk and protective factors.